Hey, this is Doug with The Art of Immersion, and today we're going to talk about why The Hobbit failed.
I see fire in silence inside.
So there's a lot of reasons why The Hobbit didn't really live up to The Lord of the Rings. Whether it be the fact that they stretched one book into 3 movies, they introduced characters that were in The Lord of the Rings that weren't really in The Hobbit, or just that in general it was a shameless cash grab. However you look at it, The Hobbit definitely wasn't the same. But a lesser known reason as to why The Hobbit just didn't really feel right has to do with how they actually filmed it, and that has to do with frame rate. The Hobbit, Gemini Man, and a couple other films have adopted what's called a high frame rate, shooting at a higher frame rate than standard cinema. So I'm a motion designer and I'm a director, and frame rate is something that I encounter a lot in my work. When I'm filming live action, I'm typically shooting around 24 frames per second. But when I'm animating for motion design, projects tend to be a lot slower than that, typically around 12 frames per second. And that has to do with how animation works. So first off, what is frame rate? So as most people probably know, when you're watching a movie or a TV show or playing a video game, you're not actually watching true motion happen in front of you. You're watching a series of images that are played back so quickly that your brain just thinks that it's moving at a constant speed. The speed that the images are played back is called frame rate, and that's frames per second. So standard cinema is 24 frames per second. Television is usually 30 frames per second. And video games are anywhere from 30 to 60. So why are filmmakers talking about high frame rate? 24 frames per second is something that we're all used to, but it's not true motion. When you're shooting at 24 frames per second, the shutter is open for a lot of time, relatively, which means a lot of light is being brought into the camera, into the sensor, and there's a lot of motion blur happening because the camera isn't capturing things right as it happens. That's partly why cinema has a very distinct look. There's a reason why when you're watching a movie, it looks different from something that you're watching that you shot on your phone. It's not just the lighting and the acting and the production value, it's also just the frame rate at which it was filmed. Motion blur is a big reason as to why things look like cinema. So 24 frames per second introduces a lot of motion blur, and a higher frame rate produces a lot less motion blur. That's why you tend to see higher frame rate for sports filming, for example. You want to see everything that's happening second by second. You don't want there to be a big blurry mess when you're watching things. The same logic can be applied to visual effects. Motion blur is an in-camera phenomenon. It's filmed in the camera on the film footage or on the digital sensor. And visual effects doesn't have that issue. When you're filming at low frame rates, you have to match the visual effects to the footage, which means adding motion blur and noise to make it blend together better. Filming at high frame rates, on the other hand, matches the footage to the visual effects, meaning the visual effects can exist in its crisp digital glory and not have to be made to look worse. So The Lord of the Rings was highly regarded for many reasons, one of those being visual effects. So when the Hobbit trilogy came around, Peter Jackson wanted to try something new, i.e. try to film in high frame rate to see if the visual effects would be even better. The Hobbit is filmed in 48 frames per second. That's double the standard cinema frame rate. People were really excited about The Hobbit before it came out. There was so much goodwill given to the filmmakers on behalf of The Lord of the Rings that everyone just assumed this would be a knock out of the park. When the first 10 minutes of the 48 frames per second footage of The Hobbit was premiered at CinemaCon in 2012, audiences were furious. It looked like soap opera. A lot of people likened it to filming a theatrical production on stage and a very poorly made one. People complained that the special effect makeup looked really bad, prosthetics were bad, it just looked cheap. Obviously, The Hobbit was not a cheap movie to make, so why did this happen? Well, you can argue that it doesn't really have to do with frame rate itself. 24 frames per second allows a certain amount of light into the camera. When you're shooting at a higher frame rate, you're letting less light into the camera, and you need a different style of lighting, i.e. a lot more lights, to make it look the same. Now, prosthetics and special effects makeup are a huge part of fantasy films like The Hobbit. Those are all designed to look good, not to the human eye, but to the camera. And they're designed to look good to a camera that's filming at 24 frames per second with a very specific lighting setup. When you're adding a lot more light to the scene, all of a sudden the camera can see things that it really shouldn't have been able to see before. So the production just wasn't really ready for a high frame rate camera. In my opinion, this high frame rate issue became kind of a canary in the coal mine for how the rest of the world would receive The Hobbit. Focusing on something very technical at the expense of good storytelling was kind of what defined The Hobbit.
Now, if you saw The Hobbit in theaters, you likely didn't watch a 48 frames per second cut. For the most part, movie theaters screened it at the normal 24 FPS. This is due not just to the backlash, but also just with theatrical limitations.
There have been other high frame rate movies since, like Ang Lee's Billy Lynn's Halftime Walk and Ang Lee's The Gemini Man. Both of those films have not fared very well.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground! You underestimate my power! Don't try it!
You can argue that it's not necessarily just a high frame rate issue. People liken it to really crisp footage that looks high definition, but not cinema. We're also used to 24 frames per second, that anything above that, as beautiful as it looks, just doesn't hit our brains in the same way. But the main question is, does high frame rate really make visual effects look better? And the answer is yes, it does.
The whole visual effects experience is more immersive with high frame rate.
But there's also another argument to be made here, which is that should visual effects really be trying to look real? We don't go to cinema to see real life. We go to cinema to see cinema, an exaggerated version of real life. And the problem with making visual effects look real is that it's kind of always going to be impossible. I believe there will always be some level of artifice that we just recognize, either consciously or subconsciously, and that will take us out of the film of whatever we see. So the goal isn't, in my opinion, how to make things look more real, it's how to make things look more stylized. There are many examples of films that have gone the opposite route, and not just tried to make things look real, but tried to make things look like they're in their own little world. And those films typically have the best visual effects. But I want to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments. Is visual effects heading towards high frame rate? And if so, is that a good thing? Do you think that visual effects should look more like real life? Or should they look more like their own thing? If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you didn't like it, thumbs down and leave a comment. Thanks everyone. Until